Amara Johnson stood silently by the large floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse suite, gazing at the glittering expanse of New York City stretched out beneath her. The lights of the city skyline blinked back at her, a constant reminder of the endless hustle below, a sea of dreams both broken and fulfilled. She had made it, beyond what most people from her background could have even dared to imagine. And yet, as she stood there, high above the chaos, something unsettled gnawed at her soul. She was a woman of power, no doubt about that. Amara had built her empire from the ground up, an empire of opulence and luxury that catered to the wealthy elite. Amara Resorts wasn't just a name, it was a statement. Each of her hotels across the country had become synonymous with elegance, exclusivity, and unparalleled service. Guests of her hotels expected nothing less than perfection, and she had delivered on that expectation with meticulous precision. But tonight, as she looked out at the lights blinking on and off in the city below, Amara felt a strange emptiness. She was no stranger to pressure or doubt. After all, being a black woman in the male-dominated world of high-end hospitality had taught her how to endure in ways few could understand. Her road to success had been littered with obstacles, from racism to sexism to the simple disbelief that someone from her background could succeed at such heights. Yet, she had overcome it all. But this feeling, this nagging discomfort, was different. Amara turned away from the window and walked over to the sleek bar set in the corner of the room. She poured herself a small glass of wine and took a sip, her mind drifting to the whispers she had overheard in the hotel lobby earlier that week. "Have you heard about the homeless problem outside the hotel? It's getting worse every day." The voice belonged to one of her managers, David, who had been discussing the situation with another staff member. Amara had been walking past them on her way to a meeting when she caught the exchange. "They're starting to make the guests uncomfortable. Securities had to chase them off more than once." Amara had stopped just out of sight, her ears suddenly attuned to the conversation. "Yeah, I heard. One of them was sitting right outside the entrance last night, practically begging as the guests walked by. It's not good for business." That phrase, "not good for business," had lodged itself in Amara's mind like a thorn. She had been preoccupied with it ever since, thinking about the implications of what it meant for her hotel, her staff, and most importantly, the people on the street outside. These were human beings, and yet they were being treated like problems, obstacles to the pristine image her hotels projected. She took another sip of wine and exhaled slowly. The truth was, she had seen them herself, the homeless men and women who gathered in the alleys near the hotel, sitting on cold concrete, wrapped in tattered blankets, holding cardboard signs that begged for help. Amara had walked past them many times, and while she had always made a point of acknowledging their presence with a nod or a quick smile, she had never really seen them. Not in the way that mattered. The discomfort in her gut tightened. Had she become so insulated in her own success that she had forgotten what it was like to be on the other side? To be invisible? There was a knock at the door, and Amara's assistant, Lisa, stepped into the room. "Amara, the board is waiting for you downstairs." Amara glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. She had lost track of time. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for this evening, and the executives would be eager to discuss the numbers, profits, expansions, and the usual performance metrics. But tonight, Amara felt disconnected from all of it. The thought of discussing financials while the people outside her hotel were being treated as nuisances made her stomach churn. "I'll be right there," she said, her voice steady but distant. Lisa gave her a brief nod and left, the soft click of the door echoing in the silence. Amara set down her glass and took one last glance at the city below before straightening her blazer and heading for the elevator. The boardroom was grand, as one would expect from a hotel of Amara's caliber. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft lighting, and the windows offered an uninterrupted view of the city skyline. Seated around the table were the key players in her empire, executives, managers, and top financial advisors. They all rose slightly as Amara entered, a sign of respect for the woman who had built everything they now enjoyed. "Good evening, everyone," she said, taking her seat at the head of the table. "Let's get started." The usual formalities began. Reports were read, numbers were discussed, and graphs were presented. Amara nodded along, occasionally offering her input when necessary. But her mind was elsewhere. It drifted back to the people outside, those who had no seat at any table, much less one as opulent as this. "Profits are up 12% this quarter," said James, her chief of operations, his tone laced with pride. "And with the new expansions planned for Los Angeles and Chicago, we're projecting even stronger growth over the next fiscal year." There was a murmur of approval around the table. Amara, however, remained quiet, her fingers tapping lightly on the table as she mulled over her next words. "James," she said suddenly, cutting through the chatter. "I've heard some disturbing things about the way our staff is handling certain situations outside the hotel." James paused, clearly caught off guard. "Situations?" "The homeless," Amara clarified. "I've heard that security has been pushing them away from the entrances, that they've been treated with disrespect." The room fell silent. James shifted in his seat, glancing at the others before responding. "Well, Amara, you know how it is. We have to maintain a certain image for the guests. Some of them have expressed discomfort with the presence of, well, you know, people lingering near the property." Amara's gaze hardened. "People," she repeated. "Not problems, not nuisances. People." James swallowed. "Yes, of course. But the guests." "I don't care about the guests' discomfort," Amara interrupted, her voice firm. "What I care about is how we, as a company, treat human beings. If we've built a brand that only caters to those who can afford our luxury, then what does that say about us?" "About me." There was an uneasy silence around the table. No one dared to speak. Amara leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew what she had to do. There was no way she could sit in this boardroom and preach about human dignity without first understanding the reality outside those walls. "I'm going to handle this myself," she said finally, her decision made. James looked confused. "What do you mean?" Amara stood, gathering her papers. "I'm going to find out exactly what's happening outside our hotel. And I'm not going to do it from this penthouse." With that, she walked out of the boardroom, leaving her executives speechless. That night, Amara lay awake in her penthouse, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't just send someone to investigate. She needed to experience it firsthand. If she was going to understand what those living on the streets went through, what her own staff thought of them, she had to see it for herself. She reached for her phone and dialed a number. "Lisa," she said when her assistant answered. "I need you to clear my schedule for the next week. I have something important to take care of." And with that, the plan began to form. Amara Johnson, billionaire hotel mogul, would walk the streets not as the powerful woman she had become, but as one of the invisible souls she had spent so long overlooking. Amara sat at her desk the next morning, her coffee growing cold as she mulled over the gravity of what she was about to do. The bustling city outside her penthouse window seemed worlds away from the task ahead, but she was resolute. The plan had solidified overnight, and there was no turning back. She had made the decision: if she was going to understand what life was like for those society cast aside, she needed to step into their shoes, literally. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Lisa, her ever-efficient assistant, calling to confirm that the week's schedule had been cleared, per Amara's instructions the night before. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson. I've rescheduled all your meetings, and the board has been informed that you'll be out of town handling a personal matter." Amara smiled at Lisa's careful phrasing. "Thank you, Lisa. I'll need your help with something else." "Of course, whatever you need." Amara took a deep breath. "This next part would be crucial. I need you to find me a makeup artist. Someone discreet. I'm going undercover." There was a momentary pause on the other end. "Undercover?" Lisa echoed, clearly surprised. "Yes," Amara said, her tone firm. "I'm going to be spending some time living as one of the homeless outside our hotel. I want to see what it's really like, and I can't be recognized." There was another pause, this time longer. Amara could almost hear Lisa's brain trying to process the gravity of her request. "Ms. Johnson, are you sure about this? I mean, there are easier ways to—" "I'm sure," Amara interrupted, her voice soft but resolute. "I appreciate your concern, Lisa, but I need to do this myself. I'll need clothes too, something that will help me blend in." Lisa exhaled, clearly uncomfortable but loyal to a fault. "I'll take care of it." Amara hung up, feeling the weight of her decision sink deeper into her bones. It was one thing to be determined in the heat of the moment, but now that the plan was in motion, the reality of what she was about to do was setting in. She, a billionaire hotel mogul, would be stepping out into the world not as the powerful woman she had built herself to be, but as one of the faceless individuals her world often ignored. Later that afternoon, a woman named Elena, a makeup artist Lisa had found through her extensive network, arrived at Amara's private office. Elena was known for her transformative work in film and television, specializing in prosthetics and disguise. When she stepped into the room, she greeted Amara with professional confidence, though Amara could see the curiosity in her eyes. "I was told you needed something unconventional," Elena said, setting her toolkit on the large oak desk. Amara nodded, explaining her situation. "I need to disappear for a while. I need to look like someone who has been living on the streets for a long time. I don't want anyone to recognize me." Elena studied Amara carefully, nodding as she processed the challenge. "I can make that happen. It's all about the details, the skin texture, the hair, the clothes. People tend to overlook the homeless because they don't want to see them, but you still need to look authentic. No one can suspect anything." Amara watched as Elena unpacked her tools: makeup, prosthetics, hair products, and what seemed like 100 other tiny items that Amara couldn't identify. Elena's hands moved with the practiced ease of an expert as she began her work, transforming Amara piece by piece. First came the skin. Elena applied layers of makeup, darkening Amara's complexion with subtle patches of grime and dirt, creating the illusion of someone who hadn't washed in days, maybe weeks. She used prosthetics to make her cheeks appear more hollow, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. Then came the hair. Once sleek and impeccably styled, it was now matted and uneven, as though it had been neglected for a long time. Elena's attention to detail was astonishing, every stroke of her brush adding to the illusion. By the time she was finished, Amara barely recognized herself. Staring into the mirror, she saw a woman who looked nothing like the powerful hotel owner she knew so well. Instead, she saw someone worn down by life, someone struggling to survive. "Is this me?" Amara asked softly, touching her face in disbelief. Elena smiled faintly. "Not anymore." The final piece of the transformation was the clothing. Lisa had found what Amara needed: a tattered, oversized coat with stains that spoke of countless cold nights spent outdoors, a pair of mismatched gloves, and scuffed, torn shoes. Amara put them on slowly, feeling the weight of the disguise settle over her like a second skin. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror once more, the image was complete. She had become someone else entirely, someone invisible. She spent the next few hours rehearsing her new persona in her mind. Sarah. That would be her name for the next few days. She practiced walking with a limp, shoulders hunched, and face downcast, mimicking the way she had seen the homeless carry themselves on the streets. It wasn't just about looking the part, she had to become it. By nightfall, she was ready. Amara left her penthouse in the early evening, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city streets. She felt a strange sense of detachment as she walked away from her life of luxury, her usual entourage and security detail nowhere in sight. She hadn't told anyone outside of Lisa what she was doing. Even her closest friends and family were unaware. To them, she would simply be out of town for business. As she walked toward her hotel, now just another figure blending into the crowded streets of New York, Amara felt the first pangs of fear. She was used to being in control, to having power over her surroundings. Now, she had none. She was just another nameless, faceless person walking the streets, someone nobody would stop to help or even acknowledge. When she reached the street just outside her hotel, she paused. The grand entrance loomed ahead, golden lights illuminating the polished marble floors beyond the glass doors. Guests in designer suits and evening gowns walked in and out, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the world outside. But Amara didn't walk through those doors. Instead, she made her way to the alley beside the hotel, where she had seen the homeless gather on countless nights. Her heart pounded as she approached, her senses now attuned to every sound, every movement around her. This was the moment. This was what she had come for. She found a spot at the far end of the alley, a dark corner shielded from the streetlights, and sat down on the cold pavement. Wrapping her arms around herself, she leaned back against the rough brick wall and exhaled slowly. The city noises, honking cars, distant chatter, the hum of neon signs, faded into the background as she focused on the task at hand. This was her new reality, at least for the next few days. She was no longer Amara Johnson, the powerful businesswoman. She was Sarah, the homeless woman. And no one could know otherwise. As the hours passed and the cold began to seep into her bones, Amara realized just how far she had distanced herself from this world. She had once believed she understood hardship, having grown up poor and having to fight her way to the top. But this was different. This was survival in its rawest form. People passed by without a second glance, just as she had expected. For the first time in a long time, Amara felt truly invisible. And with that invisibility came a deep, uncomfortable realization. This was how they lived. Every day. The chill of the pavement seeped through Amara's worn coat as she sat huddled against the cold brick wall in the alley. It had only been a few hours, but her body already ached from the hardness of the ground, and the bite of the evening air was beginning to settle into her bones. For the first time in her life, she felt utterly exposed. She wasn't used to being ignored. She wasn't used to being unseen. As the powerful owner of one of the most prestigious hotel chains in the country, Amara Johnson had grown accustomed to command, and to the attention that followed her wherever she went. But now, as Sarah, a homeless woman with nothing but a tattered coat and a few layers of grime to her name, she felt the sharp sting of invisibility in a way she had never imagined. People passed by without so much as a glance in her direction. Some walked hurriedly, their faces turned away, pretending not to see her. Others barely acknowledged her presence, as if she were just part of the scenery, a piece of the city's gritty backdrop that they'd rather not confront. She had always known, intellectually, that the homeless were often ignored, but experiencing it firsthand was jarring. As the night deepened, Amara watched the comings and goings of her hotel guests with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. The contrast was startling. Just a few feet from where she sat, guests entered the glittering lobby with ease, greeted by polished doormen and concierge staff who opened doors with a practiced smile. Inside, they would be met with warmth, luxury, and service beyond expectation. The sharp divide between her world of comfort and the reality she now inhabited was striking. She pulled the thin collar of her coat tighter around her neck, trying to stave off the cold. Despite the costume, the makeup, and the dirt, she still felt like an outsider here. The discomfort was more than physical, it was mental. Her mind swirled with questions. How did these people live like this? How long had some of them been on the streets? And most pressing of all, how had she, someone who prided herself on understanding struggle, become so disconnected from their reality? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. A hotel security guard, wearing a dark uniform with the hotel's crest emblazoned on his jacket, was walking towards her. Amara watched him, her pulse quickening as he drew closer. This was it, the moment she had feared, but also the one she had anticipated. The guard stopped a few feet from her, eyeing her with clear disdain. His expression was hard, his jaw set as he assessed her. "Hey," he barked. "You can't sit here." Amara swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She had prepared herself for this, but the reality of the confrontation still hit hard. She lowered her gaze, trying to stay in character. "I'm not hurting anyone," she mumbled, her voice low and rougher than usual, hoping it sounded convincing. The guard took a step closer, his voice growing more aggressive. "I said you can't sit here. We don't allow vagrants around the hotel." Vagrants. The word stung, sharper than she expected. Amara felt a flicker of indignation rise within her, but she quickly pushed it down. She was Sarah now, and Sarah couldn't fight back the way Amara would. "I'll move," she said softly, her eyes still downcast. But the guard didn't move on. Instead, he crossed his arms, glaring down at her. "This isn't a shelter. If you don't get out of here, I'll call the police." "Got it." Amara's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. The harshness in his voice was chilling. He didn't see her as a person, just a nuisance, an inconvenience to be swept away like trash on the street. She wanted to speak, to tell him who she really was, to remind him that she was the one who signed his paychecks. But she couldn't. Not yet. "I understand," she muttered, her voice barely audible as she rose to her feet. Her legs were stiff from sitting too long, and her body protested as she stood. The guard watched her with a mixture of contempt and boredom. As she shuffled away from the alley and into the shadows of the nearby buildings, she could feel his eyes following her until she was out of sight. Her stomach churned with a mix of humiliation and anger. The reality of what had just happened hit her harder than she had anticipated. She had expected to be ignored, maybe even pitied, but the sheer hostility, so casual, so routine, was shocking. How many times had this same scene played out with others who had nowhere else to go? She kept walking, her feet dragging over the uneven pavement, the sounds of the city buzzing around her like a distant hum. Her hotel, her empire, was only a few steps away, yet she had never felt further from it. She had built a kingdom of luxury and comfort, but the people just outside its walls were treated as less than human. Amara didn't stop until she reached a small park several blocks away from the hotel. The dim light of a street lamp cast long shadows over the benches and patches of grass, where a few figures sat huddled in the dark. She hesitated for a moment before walking toward them, her breath visible in the cool night air. A woman sitting on one of the benches looked up as Amara approached. She was older, maybe in her late 50s, with graying hair and a weathered face that bore the marks of years spent in hardship. Her clothes were worn and layered, a mismatched collection of jackets and scarves that seemed to have been scavenged over time. Amara stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. The woman studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if she understood. "First time out here?" the woman asked, her voice raspy but kind. Amara blinked, surprised by the question. She had expected indifference, but the woman's eyes were sharp, perceptive. "Yes," Amara replied after a moment. "First time." The woman gestured to the space next to her on the bench. "Zit. You'll get used to it." Amara hesitated, then sat down slowly. The bench was cold, but it felt like a relief after the hardness of the alley. She glanced at the woman beside her, wondering how long she had been living like this. "I'm Martha," the woman said, her voice softer now. "Sarah," Amara replied, the name slipping from her lips without hesitation. Martha nodded again, pulling her coat tighter around her. "You learn quick out here. People won't see you, and the ones who do, well, they're not always kind." Amara felt a pang of guilt in her chest. This woman had no idea who she really was, but her words rang true. Amara had built her life on being seen, on commanding attention and respect. But out here, in this world, she was invisible. And it was only beginning to sink in just how different her life was from the lives of those she had promised herself she would help. For the next hour, Amara and Martha sat in silence, the cold settling deeper into their bones. Cars passed by on the streets nearby, people moved through the city, and life carried on as if they weren't even there. Amara knew that this was only the beginning of her journey, but already the weight of it felt immense. The next morning arrived cold and gray, the early light casting long pale shadows across the park where Amara had spent the night. Her body ached from sleeping on the bench, and her joints were stiff from the cold that had settled in her bones. For a moment, as she sat up and rubbed her tired eyes, she forgot where she was. The illusion shattered when she looked down at her tattered coat, now stained from the dampness of the night, and her shoes, still scuffed and worn. It hadn't even been 24 hours, and Amara already felt the weight of living on the streets pressing down on her. The soreness in her muscles was a small price to pay compared to the mental and emotional exhaustion that came with being ignored, judged, and dismissed by almost everyone she had encountered. She felt a gnawing hunger in her stomach, a sharp reminder that her life had shifted drastically overnight. Martha, her companion from the night before, was still asleep on the bench beside her. The older woman had been a quiet but steady presence, offering her a place to sit, and in doing so, a kind of unspoken companionship. Amara had stayed silent for most of the night, absorbing the sights and sounds of the streets, trying to understand this new reality she had thrust herself into. Martha had occasionally muttered under her breath, mostly incoherent, though Amara caught pieces of her past, a lost job, a husband who had passed away, and eventually, the slide into homelessness. Amara felt an odd sense of gratitude for Martha's presence. The woman had treated her with quiet dignity, never prying into her story but still offering small words of comfort that made the harshness of the streets more bearable. Her stomach growled again, louder this time. She needed food. For the first time in years, Amara had to confront the very real question of how she was going to eat. Her usual breakfast, a fresh fruit bowl, Greek yogurt, and freshly brewed coffee, seemed like a distant memory, something that belonged to another life. In this life, food would be whatever she could find. She slowly rose from the bench, careful not to disturb Martha, and began to make her way back toward her hotel. The grand building loomed in the distance, its shiny exterior a stark contrast to the streets around it. Despite her hunger and exhaustion, she reminded herself of why she was doing this, to experience the life she had once overlooked, to see how the people on the margins of society were treated by those inside her hotel. When she approached the hotel's side entrance, she found a group of people, other homeless men and women, gathered nearby. Some were huddled together for warmth, while others sat in silence, their faces drawn with the weariness of survival. Amara felt a flicker of hesitation as she neared them, unsure of how to approach. She had spent so many years at the top, dictating the terms of how people should be treated in her hotels, but now she was stepping into a world where she was the outsider. As she neared the back of the group, she overheard snippets of conversation, mostly about where to find food or shelter for the night. She caught sight of a younger man, his face gaunt and his clothes hanging loosely on his thin frame. He held a styrofoam cup, shaking it lightly as passers-by walked by, hoping for change. "Hey," Amara said softly as she approached, trying to sound casual despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. The man looked up, his eyes tired but kind. "You new here?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. "Yeah," Amara replied, pulling her coat tighter around her. "Just trying to figure out where to go." He nodded in understanding. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. They sometimes give out breakfast, but it fills up fast." Amara's stomach twisted with hunger. "Thanks for the tip," she said, glancing toward the hotel entrance. "Do they ever? I mean, does anyone ever get food from the hotel?" The man's lips twisted into a half-smile, half-sneer. "Not unless you're lucky. Most of the staff just tell us to move along. Every now and then, someone sneaks out some leftovers, but it's rare." Amara felt a pang of guilt. This was her hotel, her responsibility. And yet, to the people outside, it was just another place that turned them away. Just then, the hotel side door opened, and a young woman in a hotel uniform stepped out, carrying a tray of sandwiches wrapped in paper. She moved quickly, trying not to attract too much attention, but Amara noticed her immediately. She was one of the hotel's kitchen staff, likely on break. The woman glanced around nervously before approaching the group of homeless people. "Here," she said in a hushed tone, setting the tray on the ground. "Take them before anyone sees." The group immediately moved toward the tray, their hunger overtaking any sense of caution. Amara watched as they each grabbed a sandwich, their faces lighting up with a mix of gratitude and desperation. Amara approached slowly, locking eyes with the woman in the hotel uniform. She couldn't have been more than 22, with tired eyes and a nervous energy that suggested she had done this before. Amara hesitated for a moment, then reached out to take one of the sandwiches. "Thank you," she said quietly, meeting the young woman's gaze. The woman nodded quickly, her eyes darting around as if she expected to be caught at any moment. "I can't do much," she whispered, "but people shouldn't go hungry." Before Amara could respond, the woman turned and hurried back into the hotel, the door closing softly behind her. Amara stood there, sandwich in hand, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. The gesture had been small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it was a glimmer of humanity in a world that had shown her mostly cruelty. She unwrapped the sandwich and took a bite. It was simple, ham and cheese on a soft roll, but in that moment, it tasted like a feast. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for the kindness that had been shown to her. As she finished the sandwich, Amara found herself reflecting on the young woman's quiet act of compassion. It was clear that not everyone in her hotel had lost their sense of empathy. There were still people willing to bend the rules, even at their own risk, to help those in need. It was a small victory, but one that filled her with a sense of hope. Not everything was broken. Not everyone was blind to the suffering happening right outside the hotel doors. Later that day, Amara returned to the park where she had left Martha. She found the older woman sitting in the same spot on the bench, staring out at the city with a distant look in her eyes. Amara sat down beside her, the sounds of the city filling the silence between them. After a few minutes, Martha spoke, her voice hoarse. "I see you found something to eat." Amara nodded. "Yeah." A girl from the hotel brought out some sandwiches. Martha let out a small, dry laugh. "One of the good ones, then. Not everyone inside those fancy walls is heartless." Amara smiled faintly. "No, not everyone." They sat in silence for a while longer, the cold wind whipping through the trees around them. Despite the bleakness of their surroundings, Amara felt a strange sense of calm. Her time on the streets was far from over, but she had already seen both the cruelty and the kindness of the world she had stepped into. As the day wore on, Amara knew that the hardest part of her journey was still ahead. There were more truths to uncover, more challenges to face. But for now, she took comfort in the knowledge that, even in the harshest of environments, there were still glimmers of light. The days that followed felt longer and colder as Amara continued her life as Sarah, blending into the world of the homeless. The cold sting of the pavement was now familiar, as was the feeling of being overlooked and ignored. Each morning, she woke up with a stiffness in her bones, a gnawing hunger in her stomach, and the heavy knowledge that the world beyond the alley barely cared whether she existed. She had lived her life believing she understood hardship. She had faced discrimination, fought her way up the corporate ladder, and built her empire with grit and determination. But this life on the streets, was something else entirely. It wasn't just about survival, it was about becoming invisible, something Amara had never experienced until now. The most striking revelation came not from the world's coldness, but from her own hotel's treatment of people like her, people they saw as a nuisance. Every day, Amara witnessed how the staff at her hotel handled the homeless. Most of them followed orders, chasing people away from the hotel's entrance, acting like gatekeepers of a fortress of luxury. The contrast between the polished marble floors inside and the gritty asphalt outside couldn't have been more pronounced. She had expected harshness, even cruelty, but nothing could prepare her for the hurt she felt seeing the place she had built with pride contributing to that kind of suffering. But amid the pain, she had also seen glimpses of kindness. The young woman who risked her job to bring out sandwiches, the rare security guard who turned a blind eye instead of shoving people away. These moments of humanity gave her hope, but they were fleeting. Amara's time as Sarah was coming to an end. After days of living on the streets, she knew she had learned all she needed to know. But the real challenge wasn't just surviving the experience, it was what came next. On the morning of the final day, Amara decided it was time to return to her real life, to confront her staff and executives with everything she had seen and experienced. She hadn't informed anyone about her plan, but now, she wanted them to see her as they never had before. She wanted them to understand the reality of the world they were so eager to push away. She stood outside the hotel once more, her body covered in the grime and exhaustion of the past few days. This time, she didn't sit in the alley, didn't try to disappear. Instead, she stood in front of the hotel's grand entrance, her eyes scanning the faces of the people walking past. She saw pity in some of their eyes, disgust in others. She had grown used to those looks. After a few minutes, the door to the hotel opened, and James, her chief of operations, stepped outside. His eyes swept across the street, landing on Amara without a hint of recognition. He walked briskly past her, muttering something under his breath about keeping the front clear of loiterers, but didn't stop. Amara's heart pounded as she watched him walk into the crowd, unaware that the woman he had just ignored was his boss. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and headed inside the hotel. The transformation was immediate. As soon as she crossed the threshold, Amara was no longer invisible. A sharp intake of breath from the concierge behind the front desk cut through the quiet hum of the lobby. His eyes widened in shock as he took in her appearance, disheveled, dirty, clearly homeless. He started to move toward her, likely to tell her to leave, but Amara raised a hand. "I need to speak to James," she said, her voice steady, despite the tension in her body. The concierge hesitated, looking from her to the security guard at the entrance, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. After a brief pause, he picked up the phone and made a call. Amara waited in silence, her heart racing. She hadn't told anyone about her plan to reveal herself this way. She wanted to catch them off guard. The image of her, disguised, filthy, and exhausted, would force them to confront the uncomfortable truth she had uncovered. James appeared moments later, walking into the lobby with a clipboard in hand, clearly preoccupied. When his eyes landed on Amara, he barely glanced at her before addressing the concierge. "What's the issue?" This woman, she says she needs to speak to you," the concierge stammered. James glanced at Amara, irritation crossing his face. "Look, we've been over this. You can't." "I'm Amara Johnson," she interrupted, her voice firm, cutting through the confusion. James froze, his brow furrowing in disbelief. He looked at her again, this time closer, his eyes widening as the realization hit him. He blinked, stepping back as if he had been struck. "Ms. Johnson," he whispered, his voice filled with shock. Amara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, James. It's me." For a moment, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. The other employees glanced at each other, some whispering in disbelief. The once pristine and controlled environment of the hotel felt chaotic, as if the very walls were reacting to the presence of the woman they had cast aside only moments ago. James stared at her, his face pale. What's going on?" he stammered, clearly struggling to comprehend the situation. "Why are you?" Amara took a step forward, her voice steady but full of the weight of the days she had spent on the streets. "I've been living as a homeless woman outside this hotel for the past few days," she said, her eyes boring into James. "I've seen how our staff treats people who have nothing. How you treat people who are just trying to survive. The color drained from James' face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Amara turned her gaze to the other employees in the lobby, her voice carrying throughout the space. I've seen how we close our doors to those who need help the most. How we prioritize our image over human decency. Silence followed her words, heavy and palpable. She could see the shock on their faces, the disbelief that someone as powerful as her had chosen to live among those they had been trained to ignore. But there was no turning back now. They needed to see the truth, to feel the weight of their actions. I built this hotel, Amara continued, her voice steady and resolute. I built it to be a place of comfort, a place where people feel welcome. But what I've seen over these past days, what I've experienced firsthand, has shown me that we've lost our way. James swallowed hard, his face a mask of shame. Ms. Johnson, I didn't know. Amara cut him off. That's the problem, James. None of you knew. Because none of you cared enough to look. There was a long pause as her words sank in, the weight of them crashing down on the people in the room. No one dared to move, to speak. Even the guests walking through the lobby seemed frozen in place, sensing the gravity of the moment. Amara took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying. Things are going to change. Starting today. A few hours later, Amara stood at the head of the large conference table, her executives seated in stunned silence around her. She had returned to her apartment to shower, change into her usual polished attire, and prepare for the meeting she had called. But this wasn't just a meeting. It was an ultimatum. I've made a decision, Amara began, her eyes scanning the room. There will be major changes in how we operate, not just in this hotel, but in every hotel in our chain. Effective immediately, we will be implementing new policies to ensure that every person, whether they are a guest or someone living on the streets, is treated with dignity and respect. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to expect. We will be partnering with local organizations that help the homeless, Amara continued. We'll provide food, job training, and shelter opportunities. Our hotels will no longer turn a blind eye to the suffering outside our doors. James, still visibly shaken from the events of the morning, nodded quietly in agreement. Amara's gaze was firm, unwavering. This is not negotiable. We are going to be a company that leads with compassion. That's what I expect from each and every one of you. The room was silent, but Amara could feel the shift in the air. Things were going to change. She would make sure of it. The weeks following Amara's revelation brought a whirlwind of changes to the hotel and to her life. What had begun as a quiet personal mission to understand the truth had turned into a complete overhaul of how her company, and she, viewed the world. Inside the hotel, everything was different. The air felt lighter, the staff moved with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before, and the tense atmosphere of exclusivity had started to fade. It hadn't been an easy process. Many of her senior staff, including James, had struggled to adapt to the new direction, but the results were undeniable. As part of the immediate changes, Amara had implemented a series of mandatory training sessions for all hotel staff. These weren't just your average corporate workshops on customer service. These were deep, immersive experiences where the employees were encouraged to confront their biases, their assumptions about the homeless, and the way they viewed people who didn't fit into the hotel's carefully curated image of luxury. Amara sat in on the first session herself, watching as the trainers, specialists in empathy and social justice, guided her staff through difficult, but necessary conversations. There was resistance at first. Some employees, especially the ones in higher positions, were uncomfortable with the new direction. They didn't understand why it was their responsibility to care about people who weren't paying guests. But as the sessions progressed, something shifted. The walls they had built around themselves, the barriers between us and them, began to crumble. One of the younger doormen, Marcus, spoke up during a particularly emotional session. I used to think, it wasn't my job to worry about them. The people outside, I mean. I'd see them every day, and it was easier to just ignore it. I thought, they're not my problem. But now I get it. They're people, just like the guests inside. And we've been treating them like trash. Amara felt a surge of pride as she listened. This was what she had hoped for when she first embarked on this journey, not just a change in policy, but a change in perspective. The hotel's new partnership with local organizations was also beginning to bear fruit. Amara had personally overseen the creation of a program that provided food and temporary shelter for the homeless who had once been shunned from her hotel's doorstep. A portion of the hotel's profits now went toward funding these initiatives, and her business had begun working with job training centers to help those in need find employment opportunities, some of them right within her hotels. One evening, as Amara walked through the newly created community outreach center located in a renovated section of the hotel's basement, she saw familiar faces, people she had met during her days on the streets. The once empty space was now alive with activity. Volunteers handed out food, social workers offered support, and homeless men and women found a moment of peace in a world that had long ignored them. It was there that Amara saw Martha again. The older woman, who had been a source of quiet strength during her time on the streets, was sitting at a table, filling out paperwork with the help of one of the center's volunteers. She looked healthier now, more alive, as if the weight of the world had started to lift from her shoulders. Amara approached cautiously, unsure if Martha would recognize her in her polished attire. But as she got closer, Martha looked up, and a slow smile spread across her weathered face. "Well, look who it is," Martha said, her voice warm and knowing. "Sarah, huh?" Amara smiled, sitting down across from her. "I guess I wasn't as good at hiding as I thought." Martha chuckled, shaking her head. "I knew from the beginning. You didn't walk like the rest of us. You were too careful, too unsure." Amara blinked in surprise. "You knew?" Martha nodded, her smile softening. "I've been out here long enough to spot someone who's not where they're supposed to be, but I figured you had your reasons." Amara exhaled, her mind spinning. All this time, she had believed she had fooled everyone, that she had truly stepped into another world unnoticed. But Martha had seen right through her. The realization humbled her in ways she hadn't expected. "I did have my reasons," Amara said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "I needed to see the world through your eyes. I needed to understand." Martha's expression turned serious, and she placed a hand over Amara's. "You did good, girl. Not many would have had the guts to do what you did. But don't stop now. We need people like you to keep pushing, to keep fighting." Amara nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "I'm not stopping. This is just the beginning." The next few months brought even greater change. Amara's decision to partner with shelters and community organizations didn't go unnoticed by the media, and soon, her hotels became known not just for their luxury but for their commitment to social responsibility. Articles were written about her bold approach to merging high-end hospitality with humanitarian efforts, and while some of her competitors mocked her for getting involved in charity, others began to follow suit. What surprised Amara most was the response from her guests. Far from being turned off by the presence of the outreach programs, many of her regular clients applauded the changes. Some even donated to the cause, asking how they could help. Amara realized that compassion, far from being a liability, had become an asset. Her business was thriving, not in spite of her decision to help the homeless, but because of it. The board, once skeptical, had come around as well. The numbers were undeniable. The hotel's new image had drawn in a new wave of clients, and its reputation as a leader in ethical business practices had become a major selling point. But more than that, the board had come to see the human side of the decision. They had seen Amara's commitment firsthand, and it was impossible to argue with the results. One night, as Amara stood outside her hotel, watching the steady flow of guests and volunteers moving in and out of the building, she felt a deep sense of peace. The transformation was real, not just in the hotel, but in herself. She had learned that success wasn't just about profit margins or luxury. It was about what she stood for, what her company represented. She thought back to the first night she had spent on the streets, sitting in that dark alley, feeling the sharp sting of rejection from her own hotel. She had been a different person then, powerful but blind, successful but disconnected. Now, she felt whole in a way she hadn't before. She was no longer just the CEO of a luxury hotel chain. She was someone who had faced the darkest parts of her city and come out the other side with a new understanding of what it meant to truly care for others. As she turned to head back inside, Amara caught sight of one of the security guards, a young man she didn't recognize, likely new. He was standing near the entrance, talking to a homeless woman who had just wandered over to the hotel. Amara watched as he smiled at her, offering her a cup of coffee and a warm blanket, guiding her toward the outreach center. It was a small moment, barely noticeable in the grand scheme of things. But to Amara, it was everything. Change had come, and it wasn't going anywhere.